For this final part of the presentation, we're going to consider Gorgias's the defense of Palamedes. As with the encomium of Helen, the defense of Palamedes comes from Greek myth. It's related to the Trojan War. Odysseus, who swore to go to war with Menelaus. Menelaus was the husband of Helen of Troy. Menelaus was going to war to get her back. And Odysseus was told by a prophecy that if he left, that he would not return for many years. Well, that didn't sound like a very good idea to Odysseus. So, in order to get out of his sworn obligation, he pretended to be insane. And so he took the plow and took a bag of salt and began to sow it as seed in the fields, which of course is not a very good thing to do. No sane person would do it, and no knowledgeable person would do it. So you'd have to be either insane or a fool. Well, they knew that Odysseus wasn't a fool, so he must have been insane. Well, this went on for a while, and Palamedes, who was almost as clever as Odysseus was, decided that something was fishy. And so Palamedes grabs Telemachus, Odysseus's young infant son, and places him in front of the plow to see what Odysseus would do. If Odysseus were truly insane, Palamedes reasoned he would run his plow right over his son. But what happens, of course, is Odysseus sees his son, comes to him quickly to pick him up, holds him, and kisses him, and acts like a perfectly sane father would with his infant son. Now you might think that this sounds a bit like the story of Solomon in the Old Testament, when Solomon is approached by two prostitutes, one of whom has had a baby that died because she rolled over the child, sleeping with the child in the middle of the night. In the middle of the night, she took the other prostitute's baby and switched the babies with the mothers. In the morning, there arose a dispute. It was taken all the way to the king. And the king decided that the real mother would want only the best for the child, and that somebody who would steal someone else's baby must not care very much for a baby or for others. And so he proposed to have the child cut in half, one half given to each prostitute. And as Solomon fully expected, the real mother is the one who quickly and immediately pleads for the life of the child. No, give the baby to her. It doesn't have to be to me. And so he knew that the more concerned of the two was the child's real mother. Well, a little bit something like that's going on here. Palamedes knows that any sane and good father is not going to allow its child to come to harm. Well, Odysseus wasn't very appreciative of the fact that he had been found out, and he had to go to war after all. And he told Palamedes, one day, I'll get you for this. And so when they were on the beaches of Troy, fighting in that 10-year-long conflict, Odysseus planted evidence in Palamedes' tent and framed him for conspiring with the enemies, the Trojans. On the slender evidence of the planted gold and the accusation of Odysseus, Palamedes was stoned to death. This story was well known to the ancient Greeks, and using this well-known story, Gorgias takes occasion to say, if only Palamedes had had someone like me around to argue on his behalf. Thus we are given the defense of Palamedes. As we've said, this is appeal to the Greeks on the beaches of Troy. It's his defense against the false accusations of Odysseus. And what this does is it illustrates how probabilistic reasoning works. In other words, it shows how when we reason on the basis of whether it is likely or probable that something would have happened or not, what we can do with that kind of reasoning. So let's look at this section as just one illustration. This passage is one of a lengthier speech. The speech in print is about 10 pages long. But what Gorgias has this fictionalized Palamedes do is say, if I did do this, all of the following would have to be true. And then what he'll do is consider the many possibilities that would have to follow for him to have done what he's accused of doing. If you follow along the logic of this passage, you get a very good idea of how it is that this speech works as a whole. Now, it may be alleged that we made the contract for money. He and the enemy made a contract for money. He giving, I receiving it. Was it then for a small sum? That's one possibility. But it's not probable that a man would take a small sum for a great service. So that one possibility of taking a small sum is limited. So then he goes to the other alternative. So was it a large sum? That's the more likely of the two. But then he goes on to say what's unlikely about that more likely scenario. What in that case was the means of conveyance? In other words, how does the money gotten to me? How could one person have carried it? Or are we to suppose that many carried it? But if many carried it, there would have been many witnesses to the plot. While if only one brought it, what was brought couldn't have amounted to anything much. And we've already said that it wasn't for a small amount. And again, did they bring it by day or did they bring it by night? If they brought it at night, in the latter case, there's the difficulty of the great number of guards we have around and how frequently they patrol the place. There's no way they could have got and past them. If it was by day, in the plain light of day, that makes it impossible. So this is simply how it works. Now, it also shows how kairos works. Kairos is a Greek word for the right time. You have to see it coming at you. You have to catch it as it comes. The opportune moment. You have to grab it, seize it while it's there. Kairos is a one word for time in Greek, as opposed to another word, chronos, which is the linear progression of time. We even think about our clocks. We even have a word for them, chronometers. They measure chronos. But kairos, seizing the opportune moment, that's a different qualitative way of speaking about time. What does it mean for the rhetorician? It means being very mindful of the following things. Catch it when it can. What does it mean? We have to be aware of the audience, we have to be aware of the occasion, we have to be aware of the purpose, and we have to be aware of the length that we have. In other words, we have to know who we're arguing to, what's the situation, what are we hoping to achieve, and finally, how long do we have to make this speech. All of those have to be considered when we think about kairos. Let's take a few passages from the defense of Palamedes to show how, in an implicit way, Gorgias illustrates how kairos has to be considered. This passage is in response to something that Odysseus has said. Odysseus accuses Palamedes of being both wise and insane in the same speech. Palamedes draws attention to that, and he says, how can one have confidence in a man who in the course of the same speech to the same audience makes the most contradictory assertions about the same subject? Now, something we know about Gorgias is that throughout his career he did make contradictory assertions. He made contradictory arguments. However, thinking about kairos, it would be foolish, it would be improper, it would be wrong in a given situation in the same speech and to the same audience at the same time to make contradictory assertions. That's not going to help someone's purpose as they're arguing. Now, it's possible to see different speakers maybe even make contradictory assertions to the same audience, but maybe not at the same occasion. Perhaps they'll forget. So it's all about what's appropriate right here, right now, for this audience, for this occasion, for this purpose, and for the amount of time I've got to do it in. Here's another example. He says toward the end of his speech that one thing he's not going to do is appeal to pity, to make entreaties, to bring friends in front of the audience and say, please have mercy on my friend. What he has done in the preceding part of this argument, he has given them a whole host of reasons to believe he's a credible person. He's used a lot of ethos to go back to an earlier lecture in this course. But while he uses ethos, he's not going to use pathos. He's not going to appeal to their emotions here and their pity. He says that would be fine in front of a mob. He says, but among you, the most distinguished of the Greeks, and deservingly so regarded, it is not proper to resort to persuasion by means of the intercessions of friends, or entreaties, or appeals to pity. But it's right for me to escape this charge by relying on the most perspicuous or the clearest justice, explaining the truth, and not seeking to deceive you. So notice he says when the trial takes place before a mob, that's one thing, before one audience. But in front of a different audience, it would not be proper. And so he's showing how he's mindful of kairos as he makes this argument. And in the final paragraph of his argument, he says this, I've said what I have to say and I rest my case. For to recapitulate or to summarize and to review what has already been said at length may be sensible before bad judges, it's not appropriate to assume that a body of comprised of the most eminent of the Greeks does not pay attention nor remember what has been said. As we said in an earlier lecture, summary at the end of a document is appropriate when it's a lengthy discussion and it's likely that the audience has forgotten it or needs to be reminded. But in this case, Palamedes says that's not necessary at all. So before this audience, before a bad audience would be necessary, it's not as necessary before this audience. Again, he's mindful of the kairos. So again, the defense of Palamedes, this really illustrates two things about which we would do well to pay attention, and that is, it illustrates probabilistic reasoning. If ever you're going to argue that something is or isn't likely, consider all alternatives, and then demonstrate one by one how likely or unlikely those alternatives would be. And again, to be mindful of kairos, which is the opportune moment, the right time in Greek, and for a rhetorician or someone who's intent on making an argument, that means thinking carefully about the audience, about the occasion, about the purpose, and about the length that one has allotted to them. Now, what would studying under Gorgias lead one to have? If you learn how to make the strong case appear the weaker case the stronger, how to use style to have a spellbinding effect on your listeners, how to argue probabilities in a compelling way, how to be mindful of the kairos and to match one's arguments to one's listeners. How can one do that? What would that mean? It would mean that you would walk into any situation with a lot of confidence. And as we saw, one student, Proxenius, believed he was highly confident of what he had learned and that he could go and command many men because of knowing how to argue in this way. Now we'll see in the dialogue by Socrates, called the Gorgias, that Gorgias seems very confident in his abilities. So too do his students seem very confident in their abilities. But the question, of course, is that confidence well placed? And it is Socrates' job to question them over and over and to ask them to get to the very essence of what they believe and to see if it holds up under close scrutiny. While we can see certainly that Gorgias has much to offer in showing us what it is rhetoric can do, it is Socrates' job who will then ask us what is it rhetoric should do, and that'll be the subject of the dialogue named for Gorgias. You can see these sources for further information on Gorgias and the Sophists.